Okay, here we are, chapter 7.8, and we're going to compare mixed numbers and their factors and products. Okay, so that's a little confusing. It sounds like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but I'll be able to help you understand it. We'll just kind of work through this together. We're going to look at this problem, 1.5 times 1 1/4, and it's set up in the book on 321. It says Jane has a recipe that calls for 1 1/4 cups of flour. That's this one. 1 1/4 cups of flour. But she wants to know how much flour she would need if she makes the recipe. If she wants a little more than one whole recipe, so she wants to make it 1.5 times, almost a little more than a single batch. So she has to multiply everything by 1.5, and she's trying to multiply this 1 1/4 cup of flour by 1 1/2 times so that she can make 1.5 batches. And we're looking at this, and we're going to break it apart, sort of using the distributive property. Let's change colors here. And what we notice is 1.5 times 1 1/4. And we're going to use this, this 1 times 1 1/4 is this 1 right here. And then down here, 1/2 times 1 1/4 is this 1/2. And so we're breaking it up into two pieces. So 1 and 1/2 times 1 and 1/4 can be done 1 and 1/4 times 1. So 1 and 1/4, if we go back to this color, is when we shade this, I believe we can shade at 1 and 1/4 one time. So we shade this whole thing once, and then we're going to cut this into fourths, and we could cut it like this. So there's 4 pieces, and we're going to shade 1/4. So this little piece here is shaded in to be 1/4. So when we multiply 1 times 1 and 1/4, we get 1 and 1/4. So it's equal. Okay, we know when we multiply by 1, it's equal. And we come down here and we do the next piece of the puzzle, is 1/2 times 1 and 1/4. Well, we're going to shade everything exactly the same way, but we're going to start by cutting everything in half. So now we're going to shade this, and then if we were to cut this in half again, and then cut these into fourths, just like we did last time, but we're only going to shade this much. And then we have to figure out what this is. We can see that this is 1/2 and this is 1/8. So 1/2 and 1/8 could get a little confusing unless we're going to go ahead and add our slices to this too, so that we have 1/8 and 1/8, and then we'd have 4 5/8. So 5/8 is what we get, which ends up being less. Remember, when we multiply by something less than 1, it gets smaller. I suppose we could run backwards. I'm going to just back this up, and I wonder if there's a different way. 1/2 of 1 and 1/4. No, I think that's the best way to do it. I think that we take 1 and 1/4, and if we were to go here and do our 1 and 1/4 just like we did before, there's really only way to do that, and then cut it in half and shade. This is the part we're going to use. We're not going to use any of this, and we're not going to use, because we're cutting it in half. I guess that 5/8 is the way to go. The book is a little bit unclear about that. You have half of what you started with before, so it's half of 1 and 1/4. If we're going to do the math on that, that would be 1/2 times 1 and 1/4. And 1 and 1/4 needs to be written, half of 1 and half of 1/4. So you'd have half plus 1/8. Figure out what that is. It ends up being 5/8. We see that from the picture. If we want to actually do the math, then we have to change this mixed number into an improper fraction. So it would be 1/2 times 5/4. Okay, 4 times 1 is 4/4 plus 1 is 5/4. And then when we multiply those, 1 times 5 is 5, and 2 times 4 is 8. And we can see that we got that answer. The picture is a little complicated. The math's a little complicated, so it's a good thing you guys are understanding fractions. What we're going to do, though, now is we're going to put these both together in this bottom. And when we multiply a fraction by a fraction, we know that we get something that's small, but here we're multiplying a mixed number by a mixed number. So this is greater than 1, and this is greater than 1. So we know that our answer has to be greater than 1 also. So we know that that's going to grow. And we know that we're going to multiply by 1. That's this one. And we're going to multiply by 1/2. So if I take the whole thing that I start out with, which is 1 1/4, we'll maybe use a third color here. 1 1/4, that's from this top one, plus half, which is like what we did in the second one, plus half again of the fourth. So half of the whole plus half of the fourth is this 1 1/4 plus 1/2 and 1/8, which combines together to equal 5/8. And when we add those together, we get our answer. Now, it's hard to add 5/8 onto 1 1/4. You'd have to change 1/4 into 1 2/8. That's the same as 1/4. And then I could add 2/8 to 5/8 and get 7/8. So I would end up with 1 whole plus 2/8 and 5/8 is 7/8. By using this, it's kind of the distributive property, the way this picture looks. Now, I don't think that that's the way we have to do it all the time. I think that we could probably find another way, and we're going to do that in just a second. Okay, so another way to do it is using a number line, and they want us to do that. And I want to go quickly. They want us to look at 1 times 2 1/2. So you start with a number line, 0, 1, 2, 3, and you cut them in half. And then you make a mark. 2 1/2 is 1, 2 1/2. This is 2 1/2. And you shade it in because you are taking 2 1/2 one time. That's the distance. 2 1/2 times 1 equals 2 1/2. Now if we do that again, but we change our numbers a little bit, let's see here. I'm on blue this time. 0, whoops. And we're going to do 3/5 times 2 1/2. 3/5 times 2 1/2. So I've got 1, 2, 3, and I cut it all in half. Now again, this is my point. This is 2 1/2. This is my starting point. But I'm going to take less than 1 of it. I'm only going to take 3/5 of it. Now if I count my halves, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I actually have 5 halves. So if I want to count 3 of those 5 halves, that gets me here. So this point is 3/5 of, which means times, 2 1/2, which actually equals, so if we count it over, if we put little 1, 2, 3, out of a potential for 5. So we have 3 out of 5 of 2 1/2, and that puts us at this point, which is 1 1/2. And this is really neat because you can see this easily, that 1 1/2 is the answer to 3/5 times 2 1/2 equals 1 1/2. Okay, so that works really good. What happens if we want to do one more example? And I'm running out of room, but I guess we're going to just try to squeeze it in here anyway. So we got this number line again. 0, 1, 2, 3. And I'm not sure if we're going to need it, but I'm going to add another couple. All right, we should have done that up here too. Now this time we're doing 1 2/5. whoops, not 1/2, 1 2/5 times 2 1/2. So we're still doing it 2 1/2. And if we go and we just go out here to 2 1/2, that's right here. This is 2 1/2. But we're going to do it more than once. We're going to do it 1 2/5 times. Now, if I remember that this 1 could be like 5/5. 1 is 5/5 and 2/5. So that's actually kind of like 7/5 if we wanted to write it that way. And I know that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is how many halves it takes to get to 2 1/2. That's our 5/5. And so if I were multiplying 2 1/2 by 1, that's where I would get. But I'm multiplying it by more than 1. I'm multiplying it by 1 2/5, which happens to be the same as 7/5. So I'm going to go 2 more times. Oop. I got to make sure I put my half marks in, so I actually go half a time, halves. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 halves, which ends up being 3 1/2. So it equals 3 1/2. Now this is confusing, and you might have to look at it a couple of times. And I'm tempted to just prove it to you. I'll do that real quick using the old-fashioned math. 1 2/5 times 2 1/2. So 2 times 5 times 1 is 5. 6, 7. This is 7/5. And remember, because 1 is 5/5 and 2 is 7/5. There we go. And 2 wholes would be 4 halves. 2 times 2 is 4. Plus 1 is 5. 5 halves. Remember how to do this. How to change 2 into 4 halves. And then add 1 more. And then we're just going to multiply. That's going to be 35/10. And then we have to simplify 35/10. We can divide 35 by 5, and we can divide 10 by 5. So 35/10 divided by 5 up here and divided by 5 down here gives us 7 halves. And 7 halves, 2 goes into 7 3 times with 1/2 left over. Okay, so 3 1/2 is this little point right here. It's this answer that we got. This is the actual math way to do it, and this is using these number lines. These number lines are awfully cool. I hope you guys are enjoying that. Anyway, enjoy this lesson, and we'll see you in school.